Hello, friends. Today I want to continue on with my William Adams related material, and this time I want to read a lecture delivered to the Asiatic Society of Japan in 1898 by Ludwig Riess, Dr. Professor Ludwig Riess, then of Tokyo University. Uh, and his topic was a history of the English factory at Hirado. All right, so this is after Maund Thompson has edited Cox's diary. That was published in 1883. And the reason I'm particularly reading it today is that it has been recommended, this lecture, by none other than Ernest Satow himself, who at the end of his introduction to the voyage of Captain John Surres to Japan, 1613, refers to it as excellent. And so, with that recommendation, I sort of felt obliged to look at it, even though, of course, it is likely to have been superseded in various respects. So let's take a look at it. And I'll be glad if you would accompany me in this journey through this old paper. So first of all, let's take a look at who Ludwig Riess was. And you've got a reasonably full entry on Wikipedia. Born 1861, died 1928, a German-born historian and educator noted for his work in late 19th century Japan. He was born in Prussia, the youngest of 5 children in a German Jewish family. In 1884, he traveled to Great Britain and Ireland for the purpose of collecting material for his doctoral dissertation, The Vote of the British Parliament in the Medieval Ages. Recruited as a foreign advisor by the Meiji government of the Empire of Japan in 1887 to establish Western methods of historiography into the Japanese university curriculum. He taught at Tokyo Imperial University, Keio University, and introduced European archival materials, especially Dutch sources preserved at The Hague relevant to the study of Japanese history. Riess himself made a personal search for documents when he visited Europe on leave in 1893, visiting The Hague, London, and Rome. All right, so, and he married a Japanese woman in 1888. He was head of history department at Tokyo Imperial University, but replaced in 1901. His contract was not renewed, so he went back to Germany, I think. Good. So that is Riess himself, Ludwig Riess, R-I-E-S-S. And next I want to show you, if I can find how to do that. Wait a minute. Stop the share of the Wikipedia article there. And next is the Kindle version of my edition of Ernest Satow's diary for 1895 to 1900 when he was minister in Japan. And so here we can see the entry for 23rd of November 1898. Leiden came to say, and so on. That's the German minister or attaché, I think it was. But or chargé d'affaires, I should say. At the bottom, we've got horribly cold, wet day, thermometer down to 34 degrees at 8 a.m. Asiatic Society's meeting to hear Dr. Riess lecture on the English factory at Hirado. So there we are. That's all it says about him. And then I've put a little note in my diary entry. Dr. Ludwig Riess, 1861 to 1928, PhD in British History at Berlin University, came to Japan in 1887 to teach at the Imperial University, left in 1902. Laid the foundations of the study of Western history in Japan. So rather an important individual. although his services were dispensed with fairly early on. Right, so that's that. And I think now all I have to do is to go to the text of the lecture which he gave from the Transactions, which is published in the Transactions of the Asiatic Society of Japan, volume 26, 1898. Now, he also published the paper in this volume, History of the English Factory at Hirado, but this lecture was just a summary of the paper, which was too long to read. All right, so here we are. Minutes of the meeting. A general meeting of the Asiatic Society of Japan was held at the Parish Buildings, number 54, Tsukiji. That's the foreign settlement in Tokyo. On Wednesday, the 23rd November, 1898, the president of the society, Sir Ernest Satow, being in the chair. The minutes of the previous meeting having been taken as read, the chairman called upon Dr. Riess to read his paper on the history of the English factory at Hirado. Dr. Riess read the following lecture as a summary of his paper. Mr. Chairman, that would be Satow, ladies and gentlemen, the paper on the history of the English factory at Hirado, which I have prepared for this meeting, is too long to be read here in its entirety. Instead of giving you abstracts from it, I prefer to lay before you the principal results of my investigation as briefly as possible, hoping that you will pardon my boldness in addressing you in a language foreign to me. For the sake of clearness and precision, it seems to me the best plan in the beginning to formulate some questions and supply the answers, which are given at greater length in the 7 chapters of my paper and its 4 appendices, and afterwards to give a more connected narrative. By way of preliminary, I may, however, be allowed to say a few words about the material used for this historical inquiry. The books and papers of the English factory at Hirado were brought home in the 17th century and deposited in the archives of the East India Company. What still remained of them when the present India Office was founded has been carefully preserved in the Registry and Records Department of that grand establishment at Whitehall, which is now no more, I think, I'm pretty sure. In the enormous collection of letters arranged chronologically in a series of huge volumes under the title of Original Correspondence, the factory at Hirado is exceedingly well represented considering the short period of its existence. Some of the most interesting pieces of historical material brought home from Japan had, however, previously been taken out of the library of the East India Company and never returned. Not all of these are lost to us. Some valuable letters found a new resting place among the cotton charters, and the diary of Richard Cox, the head of the English factory from its beginning to its dissolution, was purchased by the trustees of the British Museum and forms now 2 volumes of the additional manuscripts. On the whole, one must say, seldom have the beginnings of an early commercial enterprise left so many traces in public archives as this otherwise so unfortunate establishment in Japan. Nor has the advantage of being printed and published been denied to these materials brought home from Japan. Already in 1624, Samuel Purchas edited in his famous collection of travels entitled Pilgrimages, an account of the first journey of an English ship to Japan, together with the observations of its captain and some letters. He even gave a typographical facsimile of a Japanese writings, as far as I am aware, for the first time in Europe. I think there is no copy of that valuable publication to be found in Japan, but I may show you here a Dutch translation of that portion relating to Japan, published as late as 1707, and embellished with fanciful engravings in the style of that period. The next publication is 250 years later than that of Purchas. In one of the first volumes of the Hakluyt Society, Rundall, Rundall, published in 1850 from the originals in the possession of the East India Company, 6 letters of William Adams, his contract with the East India Company, and his will, which no longer exists. Then appeared the admirable Calendar of State Papers relating to the East Indies, China, and Japan, edited by Sainsbury. You would be astonished to see how many of the entries in the first 3 volumes have reference to the short-lived English factory in Japan. Koch's diary found 15 years ago an exceptionally careful and experienced editor in the person of Edward Maund Thompson, afterwards principal librarian of the British Museum. And we read the preface which he wrote. I read it the other day. Preface to Koch's diaries, that is. And this will not be the last publication of materials relating to the English factory at Hirado. I have been told that the president of our society, Satow, is about to assist the Hakluyt Society with his scholarship and his intimate acquaintance with Japanese life in publishing a new volume based on the records of the East India Company. That will be Satow's edition of Sarris's Journal, published in 1900. For there is still plenty of interesting material which has never been published. I devoted about 6 weeks of my leave of absence in 1893 to its study, and intend to edit some abstracts from Sarris's Journal and a few letters of Adams, etc. A great deal now lost to us in its original form has been rescued from oblivion by an unknown writer who, in 1824, collected material supplementary to Bruver's Annals of the East India Company. This manuscript is kept in the India office. It contains many abstracts from damaged papers, the Hirado ledger, and other books sent from India no longer accessible to us. The very scanty Japanese materials relating to the English factory of Hirado are all to be found in one volume compiled by a native of Hirado, Sugunuma Sadakaze, and entitled History of the Trade of Japan, to which a history of Hirado Harbor is attached. He died in 1889 at Manila at the early age of 26. The Toho Kyokai has done a great service for students of Japanese history by providing the funds for this publication. Question 1. What induced the East India Company to send an expedition to Japan at so early a stage of its development? You all know that the English East India Company received its charter on the very last day of the 16th century, December 31st, 1600. The instructions for Captain John Sarris to sail from London to Japan were dated more than 10 years later, April 19th, 1611. At the first glance, such an interval of more than 10 years seems sufficient for an expansion of trade connection from India to Japan after the Portuguese had, more than half a century before, shown the way and set the example. But closer inspection shows that the English sent only 7 expeditions eastward, 7 voyages as they called them, before the Japanese one, that they did not establish trade any further than Achin and Bantam, their enterprises in the Moluccas being very unfortunate. The Moluccas, the Spice Islands. While the Dutch company pushed its trade vigorously and systematically to the Moluccas, Bantam, Siam, Cochin China, that's southern Vietnam, China, Japan, the English made a sudden jump from Bantam to Japan. The motive for this rush to this country requires, therefore, an explanation. Very short and simple indeed is the explanation suggested by Rundall and repeated by Sainsbury. They state that William Adams' letter to his unknown friends, written in Japan on the 11th of October 1611, led to the opening of commercial intercourse between England and Japan 2 years afterwards. But already Hildreth, in his still valuable book, Japan as it was and is, has pointed out the chronological impossibility of this view. For already 6 months before Adams wrote that touching letter in Japan, Sarris had set sail on his pioneer expedition to Hirado. The fact is that the English East India Company was simply imitating the example of the Dutch United Company, the VOC. When the news of the successful establishment of a Dutch factory at Hirado became known in London, the English prepared at once a similar enterprise, taking it for granted that Adams, who had greatly assisted the Dutch, would do even more for his own countrymen. The governor of the East India Company wrote at once to Adams, stating that in the following year a ship would be sent to Japan. The presence of William Adams in Japan certainly encouraged the court of directors to risk such a distant establishment. But no advice or promise had been received directly from Adams either in London or Bantam when the first English expedition to Japan was dispatched in 1611. Question 2. Why was the little island of Hirado chosen as the seat of the English factory and not Nagasaki with its better harbours and more important trade? The answer is again that in London the enterprise of the Dutch was taken as a model. For the Dutch there were good reasons to prefer Hirado. The daimyo of this place, Matsuura Hoin, had offered an asylum to the two most prominent Dutchmen of the shipwrecked crew with which Adams had landed in Japan, the captain Quackenec and the Cape merchant Melchior von Zandvoort. It was the daimyo of Hirado who sent these two exiles in his own junk to Patani in 1605. This act of kindness was the reason that both seafaring nations considered the little island in the northwest of Kyushu as the proper gate of entrance into Japan. We shall see how obstinately this conviction was adhered to by the first representative of the English East India Company in this country, Captain General John Saris. Question 3. Did not Adams advise his countrymen that Hirado was not the best place for a factory? The English pioneer ship for the Japanese trade had a very slow and bad passage round the Cape Bantam. It did not arrive there until a year and a half after weighing anchor at the mouth of the Thames, viz. In October 1512, that should be 1612. At Bantam they stayed 3 months. The factor of the East India Company there, Augustine Spalding, showed them Adams' letter, then 18 months old, and probably told them how disappointed he was that Adams had not answered his more definite questions regarding trade in Japan. It was, in my opinion, the first misfortune of the earliest English expedition to this country that Adams had delayed answering those questions for about a year. What he then did write was of the greatest value. He told them what they ought to bring and what they could hope to export. Things of European origin would yield little or no profit. Eastern wares, such as pepper, Brazil wood, and Chinese goods, would always find a ready market, so he strongly recommended them to get trade with China. There would be no customs duties to pay in Japan, only a present to the emperor, i.e. Ieyasu, the king, i.e. Shogun Hidetada, and 2 or 3 secretaries would be required. Now once, he adds, if a ship do come, let her come for the easterly part of Japan, where the king's and the emperor's court is. The city of Yedo lies in 36 degrees, and about this easterly part of the land there are the best harbours and a coast so clear as there is no shoals nor rocks half a mile from the main land. It is good also for sale of merchandise, etc. He also sent them a chart of the eastern coast of Japan. Unquestionably, it was good advice, and compliance with it would have secured the success of the new enterprise. But it came too late. Adams wrote his letter at Hirado on January 12, 1613. 2 days later, the English ship, the Clove, weighed anchor to sail via the Moluccas to Japan. After some trouble with the Dutch in the Spice Islands, the English pioneer expedition arrived in Hirado harbour on June 11, 1613. Question 4. How is it that Adams did not use his influence with his countrymen to persuade them to remove from Hirado to some better place? We have the report of General Saris himself. He was the head of the voyage. He was called a general in the East India Company jargon. We have the report of General Saris himself about his doings in Japan. In the beginning, there were only merriment and holiday making on shore and on board, the old daimyo and his courtiers being frequent visitors of the English ship. No business was done except renting a house and engaging servants until Adams should arrive. Even the royal letter to the daimyo was not opened until then. The conversation was carried on by means of a Japanese whom Saris had brought from Bantam. He translated into Malay, which language Saris, as former resident of the Bantam factory, perfectly understood. In compliance with Adams' instructions left with his agent at Hirado, San Saburo, a messenger, was at once dispatched to Uraga to fetch him. Adams was then staying at Ieyasu's court at Shizuoka. The messenger passed by that place, heard at Uraga from Adams' wife where her husband was, and hurried back to Shizuoka where he found Adams. This journey to and from took him a month. Adams at once went to Hirado, arriving there within 17 days. By the inadvertence of the messenger, the English had to wait 48 days for their countryman. They may have found, however, some consolation in the fact that the stupid messenger was punished with banishment from Hirado. Adams insisted on the necessity of proceeding at once to Shizuoka and Yedo, and selected suitable presents for the high personages whose favour they stood in need of. Within a week after his arrival, he accompanied the general, Riess, and his suite on their journey to the two courts at Shizuoka and Yedo, August the 6th, 1613. But during this 1 week's stay in Hirado, Adams had already fallen considerably in the estimation of his countrymen. Here we must interrupt our narrative for a moment in order to consider what kind of man William Adams, the first Englishman residing in Japan, really was. You may find him referred to in recent literature as an unlettered pilot, or even the English sailor Adams. His behaviour is described as being sailor fashion. Now, is that a true estimate? I think not. We judge the social position of a man from 4 different data. 1, his accomplishments. Adams was certainly a well-educated man, as his knowledge of mathematics, geography, Portuguese, and Spanish sufficiently prove. 2, the position of his friends at home. He mentions in his letter Thomas Best, who was at that time general of the 10th expedition of the East India Company. Others of his old friends were advisors or contractors of that company, for Adams was originally shipwright by trade. I think Richard Irving would have something to say about that. In the first of his 5 books on Adams, he says that Adams himself declared more than once that by profession he was no carpenter and no shipwright, quoting Purchas and Farrington. Still, against that, he was asked to build 2 ships by Ieyasu and appears to have managed to do that, so I don't know what we can make of that. 3, the post offered to him, now the position for which Adams had been engaged by the Dutch, was a most honourable one. He was pilot major of a fleet, i.e., he had the entire navigation of the ships under his control. I need only mention that the famous explorer John Davis, after whom the Davis Straits are called, was not ashamed to accept the post of pilot on board a Dutch East Indiaman. 4, the style of living of his wife. Adams sent to his wife, after communication by ships between Japan and England had been established, £50 and even £60 a year. That was certainly an allowance sufficient for people of the better middle classes in those times, and far in excess of the requirements of a sailor's wife. Mrs. Mary Adams was always treated with respect and consideration by the East India Company. We therefore come to the conclusion that William Adams' milieu was superior to that of the Englishmen he had to deal with in Japan. But then why did they so quickly lose their opinion of him? The answer is that he was a man so much opposed to all ceremonies and solemn formalities that he did not even keep up the usual appearances of decorum customary in those times. His familiarity with Spanish and Portuguese mariners, the tone of equality with which the Dutch merchants treated him, the shabby appearance of Adams' own establishment at Hirado, were sufficient indications for the English merchants that Adams was not a mighty personage and favourite at court in the English sense, but a ready agent for all that would employ him. And they missed in their straightforward and easygoing countryman not only the dignified reserve of a substantial merchant, but also the exclusive patriotism they had expected of him. They still needed his advice and assistance on the journey to court, but they would not any more implicitly trust him. At Shizuoka, Ieyasu showed himself most graciously disposed towards the newly arrived countrymen of his old favourite. He bade them write out themselves what privileges they wished for. A little critical investigation of this one point alone is required in order to distinguish what was asked and what was granted and what was afterwards published in England in English and Japanese as a true copy and translation of the privileges granted by the Emperor of Japan. I have been obliged to add a special appendix dealing with these original privileges. Suffice it to say that the English got really ampler privileges than any other nation, even the Dutch. Of special interest for us is the fact that the head of the factory was granted exclusive jurisdiction over English criminals in Japan, and that Ieyasu promised them ground to build their houses on if they would establish their factory at Yedo. We see from this how much Ieyasu wished to attract the countrymen of Adams to the eastern capital. But Saris was not inclined to listen to any argument in favor of a settlement nearer Yedo. In vain did Adams take him and his suite of 8 English and 9 Japanese to his own house at Uraga and show him by a careful survey what a splendid harbour there was. When the party after ran absence of exactly three months, after an absence of exactly 3 months, returned to Hirado on November 6, 1613, Saris was quite satisfied with his success and determined to carry out his original plans, while Adams was certainly not the man to conceal his disappointment about the choice of Hirado as the center of English trade in Japan. Question 5, or part 5. Of what persons did the English factory at Hirado consist after Saris' departure? It is well known that William Adams complained to the East India Company of divers injuries done against me, the which were things to me very strange and unlooked for. But he was too noble a character to set out his grievances, as he writes, leaving it to others to make relation thereof. Some particulars of these misunderstandings between Adams and Saris you will find in my paper. I took them from unpublished entries in Saris' journal. Here we pass them over and simply consider the terms of Adams' engagement for the East India Company. There can be no doubt that he received £100 a year for his services, but the question is what services were expected from him in return for that allowance. I think it was understood that he need not give all his time to the service of the company, and that he was simply retained by them in case there should be any business at court or sea for which he was wanted. He was therefore prevented from going to sea on his own account or in the employ of others, but in Japan he could attend to his own business as long as he was not expressly charged with some affair of the company. He could also serve the court, and was even expected and encouraged to do so, as this might prove beneficial to the company. While acting for the company, he received also his travelling and other expenses. Adams was not so cheap a servant of the company as the so-called contract makes it appear at the first glance. Leaving Adams aside, we have still 7 English merchants engaged in Japan. The foremost of them was the Cape merchant, or chief merchant, Richard Cox, who with the mercantile management combined a kind of consular jurisdiction. He was already of advanced age and had formerly been established in the city of London. A 5 years' residence at Bayonne had given him full command of the Spanish language. He was a most prolific correspondent and addressed not a few of his lengthy letters to such high personages as Sir Thomas Wilson and even the Lord Treasurer Salisbury. Some of his reports from Japan were laid before King James I, who could not be induced to believe that the things written were true, but desired to speak with the writer when he comes home. Cox was sometimes prone to believe stories told him by his friends, but he was also an assiduous and faithful recorder of his own observations. His letters, and especially his diary, are of the highest value. Next in rank to the chief were the 2 senior merchants, Tempest Peacock and Richard Wickham. They received £40 a year, besides all their expenses of living, but only 1/3 of their salary was paid in Japan. The remainder was put to their credit in London. Wickham stayed 4 years in Japan. He was a clever but very excitable man, whose letters show his high spirit and strong individuality, often in an unpleasant way. A specimen of them is given in the second appendix of my paper. Then followed the merchants William Eaton and Edmund Sayers, who, like their chief, served the factory from beginning to end. The two youngest merchants, Walter Carwarden and William Nielsen, both died at an early age before their engagement for the Hirado factory had expired. When Saris left Japan, a large staff of 7 English merchants who received occasional assistance from Adams were left behind to carry on the business. And now we must ask, were the prospects good enough and the capital invested large enough for such a large number of merchants? It was certainly not a promising feature that the Clove, after a stay of 6 months, sailed from Japan under ballast. Not a proper cargo, in other words. The only things brought home from Japan by the pioneer ship were 10 screens given by Ieyasu as a present to King James, and some curiosities and picture books. But Cyrus was not discouraged by such a poor beginning. On his journey home, he wrote out a list of things suitable for the import and export trade with Japan. In the long list of profitable imports, we find but few articles of English produce, those mentioned being only woolen cloth, lead, tin, iron, steel, and all sorts of glassware. Dutch linen, Spanish soap, the Japanese word shabon is of Spanish origin, Spanish leather, honey, wax for candles, and alum are other goods recommended in his list that would have to be brought from Europe. Of things of a more aesthetic kind, he enumerates pictures, some lascivious, others of stories of wars by sea and land, the larger the better. Paintings for women's faces, large amber beads, and branch coral. That he also recommended copper as worth importing to Japan is rather astonishing. The most important articles in his list are, however, of Eastern origin: sugar, raw silk, silk stuffs, pepper, nutmeg, camphor, and Brazil wood. In return, Japan would offer for exportation rice, saltpeter, hemp, cotton wool, a blue dye almost as good as indigo, brimstone, rich writing boxes, trunks, cups, and dishes of all sorts, and of most excellent varnish, and silver and gold in great abundance. He added, however, that gold was so dear in Japan that it would not be profitable to export it. You will notice that Saris' view about a direct exchange of goods between Japan and England was more optimistic than that of Adams. The capital left with the English merchants in Japan was exceedingly small, amounting altogether to not more than £7,000 sterling. Nearly half of this money consisted of reals coined for the East India Company in the Royal Mint in London. The then current trade dollar of the East was a Spanish coin called Real of 8, because 8 of them made a peso. It was at that time calculated as equal to 5 shillings. The present Mexican dollar, and consequently the Japanese silver yen, is nothing else but the equivalent of this Real of 8, or Rial of 8 perhaps. The other half of the Clove's cargo consisted principally of English broadcloth. This had been on its way for 2 years and 2 months. No wonder that it was moth-eaten and in bad condition, as the English had not yet learned from the Dutch the necessity of lining their boxes with lead. Then there were Indian cotton goods, pepper, Chinese gold procured at Bantam, elephant's teeth, 1/6 of the total value of the invoice, gunpowder, ordnance, and ammunition, about 1/12 of the invoice of merchandise. How large must the profits be on this investment of £7,000 in order to cover the salaries and cost of living of 7 Englishmen and about 10 Japanese interpreters and servants, Adams' allowance, and the cost of transportation? 7. The organization of the English trade in Japan. The English factory did not follow the policy of their Dutch rivals, which was to do business as wholesale traders selling to Japanese shopkeepers on a credit system. They wanted to sell directly to the consumer by means of branch offices and agencies. 2 branch factories were started, one at Osaka under the charge of William Eaton, the other at Yedo under Richard Wickham. A third was established under Sayers at Tsushima for the trade with Korea, which was only of short duration. The Osaka branch had 2 subordinate agencies, one at Sakai, the other at Kyoto. There were also 2 sub-agencies of the Yedo branch factory, one at Shizuoka, the other at Uraga, while the central factory at Hirado kept an agency at Nagasaki with a foreign merchant established there. The factory had to visit their agencies from time to time The factors had to visit their agencies from time to time, staying with their Japanese representatives who were selected from among the wealthier tradespeople. From this habit, the sub-agents received the appellation of the company's hosts at such and such a place. With the exception of their host at Sakai, Toyazeimon, these persons were not found reliable and gave much trouble to the responsible chief at Hirado. But despite their many branches and agencies, the English found it very difficult to sell their wares. Their chief customer was none other than Ieyasu, who bought the 5 pieces of English ordnance and all the gunpowder offered to him at good prices. The sales of the year 1614 amounted altogether to about £2,700 sterling, of which one half was effected by the Yedo factory alone. The prices realized were profitable enough, being twice and thrice the cost price of the invoices and even more. But the trouble was that a large percentage of the English and Indian wares could not be sold at all in Japan. The broadcloth, for instance, was bought by wealthy noblemen by the piece or by the tatami or mat, meaning a 2 yards length, for covering their saddles, armor cases, and scabbards. But while black, yellow, clove color, mouse color, cinnamon, and violet were favorite colors, they would not even look at a flame color or Venice. Some of the Indian stuffs sold well, some at poor prices only, some with which the English factory was most plentifully provided, such as blue Byrams, Dutties, and red Zealous, not at all. We can very soon notice a peculiarity in the taste of the Japanese people. They liked for their garments blue or black grounds with white spots or stripes. If any red was introduced into the pattern, it would not sell. If one looks upon the dress of grown-up people in Japan at the present day, one may still observe the same rigid exclusion of any red tint. In order to get rid of some of his unsaleable commodities, Cox sent in the spring of 1614 a Japanese junk, the Raquan, to Cochin, China, southern Vietnam. 2 of his merchants, Peacock and Cawarden, went in her with a cargo amounting in value to £740 cost price, i.e. more than 1/10 of the total capital of the factory, £7,000. 1/3 of this value was represented by elephant's teeth that were absolutely unsaleable in Japan, so ivory was unsaleable. Almost another third consisted of ready money, while Indian cotton stuffs formed the principal part of the remainder. This expedition was most unfortunate. Both English merchants were killed by Cochin China noblemen in revenge for some outrages committed by the Dutch. Their money and valuables were stolen by their host there, a Japanese called Mangosa, and his accomplices, and none of it was ever recovered. It was the second severe blow that fell on the Hirado factory. At Hirado, in the meantime, everything was prepared for receiving the cargo of the second English ship, expected in June 1614, with the southern monsoon. Cox bought a house and built a godown. That's a storehouse. Then, to secure it against fire, he bought the neighbouring houses on both sides and pulled them down so that he could lay out a garden all round their buildings. Altogether, he spent £560 on the immovable property of the factory. But owing to the mistaken notions of the sailing instructions about the seasons of the monsoons, no ship arrived in 1614. This was no loss for the trade, for their stock of English and Indian goods was by no means exhausted even by the end of that year. The Cape merchant found it again necessary to find a market for some of his wares elsewhere and to procure merchandise yet better suited for the Japanese market. For this purpose, Adams had to buy at Nagasaki a strong junk, to which the name Sea Adventure was given, and to take her to Siam with a cargo of £1,330 in reals, £100 in Indian stuffs, and about as much in Japanese weapons and arms, fans and dressing boxes for women. The 2 English merchants on board, Wickham and Sayers, were instructed to buy in Siam Brazil wood, deerskins, raw silk, china stuffs, and shark skins for handles of swords. But on this voyage the Sea Adventure did not reach her destination. After 2 days' sailing, the vessel sprang a leak, which made it necessary to seek shelter at one of the Luchu Islands, the Ryukyu, as we call them, Okinawa Islands. In the port of Napa, I suppose that's Naha in modern Japanese, they repaired the junk and started again southwards after a month's detention. But near the coast of Annam, the 53 Japanese sailors became so unruly that Adams sailed back to Japan, arriving at the Goto Islands in the end of May 1615. Thus, the second expedition of the Hirado factory was again a failure. But in the third and fourth years of its existence, the English factory at Hirado came at last into better connection with Bantam. No less than 3 English ships arrived in the 10 months from September 24, 1615 to July 22, 1616, the Hoseandor, the Advice, and the Thomas. They brought, besides cloth and Indian cotton goods, in accordance with Captain Sarris' suggestions, a long list of unsaleable things such as amber, Dutch and Silesian linen, thread, 18 looking glasses, 12 dozen glass bottles, 23 dozen knives, and strangest of all, 23 dozen spectacles bought in London at from 6 pence halfpenny to a shilling apiece. Then there were pictures, but they had been spoiled by being packed face to face, and the maps sent for sale had also been ruined by cockroaches. The company had been greatly misinformed. During Tsarist times, some medicine bottles worth 3 pence in Europe had been sold in Japan for 6 shillings, but now nobody would give 1 mace or 5 pence for such a trifle. A more reasonable article was English steel, but it was only saleable at double its original price. Of raw silk, the Advice had brought only 337 catties bought at Bantam for £42 and sold in Japan at £93 per pickle of 100 catties. Of other very profitable articles, such as China stuff, Siam wood, deerskins, fishskins, wax, and pepper, they had brought nothing. And with such miserable cargo as they had sent out, the directors in London hoped to realize very great profits indeed. They hoped that the silver return from Japan might enable them to drive a great trade in the East with a small stock, and eventually even to import gold and silver into England, the export of these metals to India being very distasteful both to our state and people. Fortunately, a second expedition of the Sea Adventure, with Adams as captain, returned just in time, September 1616, to fill the coffers of the factory with the much-needed silver of Japan. The Siam wood and deerskins brought by her and 2 chartered junks sold readily at far more than double the cost price, so that Cox was enabled to spend £560 of his own earnings on trimming, provisioning, and freighting the ships sent to Bantam. The freight consisted of silver and copper for Bantam, some Japanese swords for India as presents, and a quantity of lacquered ware for England. The first 3 years of the factory at Hirado were certainly a very hard and trying beginning of an enterprise on a small scale, but they were not quite discouraging. Now, however, came a still longer period during which one misfortune and humiliation after the other befell the English traders in Japan. The years 1617, 1618, and 1619 are grouped together in the 5th chapter of my paper, The Period of Humiliation. The first lowering of their position was caused by the death of Ieyasu in May 1616. When Cox came to Yedo to pay his respects to the new ruler of Japan, he was told that the charter of 1613 could not be renewed on the same terms. In order to make it impossible for the Jesuits and friars to continue their missionary work in the disguise of merchants, no foreigner was allowed any longer to live or trade in any place except Hirado or Nagasaki. The privileges of the English nation were therefore altered so as to allow them to trade only in these 2 places. In vain did Cox and Adams make a second journey to court in the following year, 1617, to petition for a restoration of their old liberties on the ground that the English had no other but commercial interests in Japan. They were told that the shogun wished to secure the profit of distributing the imported wares in the interior to his own subjects. The factories and agencies at Yedo, Shizuoka, Uraga, Kyoto, Osaka, and Sakai were therefore withdrawn in 1617, and Hirado and Nagasaki became the only seats of English trade in Japan. It's quite a blow. The second change for the worse was that the factory remained for more than 3 years without communication by ship with Bantam, namely from July 1617 to August 1620. It was the period of keen rivalry between the English and Dutch in the Malay archipelago. The presidency at Bantam had so weak a position in the south that it could not spare a single ship for a voyage to Japan. What could the poor isolated factory at Hirado do? Very little indeed, in a mercantile way. They could still, and they did, send expeditions to Siam and Cochin China. They could and did buy from Chinese importers or Dutch mariners and sell to other Chinese or to the Japanese. And lastly, they could and did buy from Japanese sellers and resell to Japanese buyers. With their capital and local experience, they carried on an intermediate trade in the produce of the countries of the Far East. That was all. The expenses of their establishment were so large that they could simply keep themselves above water. Many a time when the gun of a foreign ship was heard, they went with their rowing boats out to help to tow her in, hoping that they could at last salute their own St. George's flag. But every time it turned out to be a Dutch ship, so that they were in the end tensed by their rivals for their unfailing kindness in always coming to see the Dutch. Teased by their rivals for their unfailing kindness in always coming to see the Dutch ships safely brought in, without ever giving them a chance to return the compliment and assistance. But the worst was still to come. On August the 9th, 1618, the English ship, the Attendance, was brought by the Dutch as prize into Hirado harbour. Their rivals had the cruelty to bring her in, as Cox writes, in a bravado, and to call the attention of their Japanese friends to this scene of English humiliation. Adams, who had left the service of the company, was at that time accompanying a Dutch embassy to the shogun's court. But Cox and his merchants thought that with his help they might get redress from the Japanese government. Cox started again on a journey to court, taking with him a long letter of complaint about this Dutch outrage in Hirado harbour. He had it nicely written by a calligrapher at Kyoto. The answer of the authorities in Yedo was that the shogun would not meddle in an affair of piracy on the high seas, as he was only lord of Japan and not of the sea, not of other kingdoms. So much were the Dutch encouraged by this reply that they even assaulted their English rivals in the streets and harbour of Hirado. When in the following year, having brought in 2 more English prizes, the Solomon and the Swan, 3 prisoners on board of the latter escaped to the English factory. They proclaimed with sound of trumpet on board of their 7 ships open war against the English nation, both by sea and land, with fire and sword, and announced their intention to take their ships and goods and destroy their persons to the uttermost of their power. They set a price of 50 reals on Richard Cox's head, and one of 30 for each of the other merchants. In an encounter in the streets of Hirado, one of the Dutch assailants was wounded. The Dutch sailors thereupon made 3 attempts in one day to storm the English factory, but Japanese swordsmen came to the rescue of the weaker party and remained as a kind of garrison in the English house. Again did Cox lay his complaint before the shogun, who was then staying in Kyoto. Orders were given to the daimyo of Hirado to hear both parties and pass judgment, but he delayed the lawsuit until the whole situation had become again changed. This change in the affairs of the factory at Hirado was brought about by the diplomatic action of the English government at The Hague. King James I was determined not only to put an end to the insupportable wrong and abuses lately done by the Hollanders unto his subjects in the East Indies, but also to amalgamate the chartered companies of both countries into one great concern for the preservation and increase of navigation and traffic in the East Indies. A so-called Treaty of Defence was concluded on July 16, 1619, according to which each company had to keep 12 ships in a common fleet of defence in the Malay archipelago and further east. At Javatra in Java, a council of defence was constituted of both presidencies. It sent at once 10 ships, 5 of each nation, on a cruise to Hirado with the following instructions. If you meet Portuguese, Spaniards, or their adherents anywhere, assault and surprise them. The captured vessels with their crews and cargoes were to be taken to Hirado, there to be equally divided between Dutch and English. Chinese junks bound for Japan and Japanese vessels were to be left unmolested. Even a port or on the coast of Japan, Portuguese vessels were not safe. Even in a port or on the coast of Japan, Portuguese vessels were not safe, but were to be forced from their anchorage under the land. It was a system of wholesale piracy for which both companies had formed their so-called fleets of defence, and Hirado was to be the basis of their operations. For the Dutch the change was not so noticeable, but the English now ceased to be the victims and became the partners of their piratical rivals. There were at that time only 3 Englishmen left in the Hirado factory. 5 of the 8 Englishmen whom Saris had left behind only 6 years and a half before had died. Peacock and Carwarden, it will be remembered, had lost their lives in that unfortunate expedition to Cochin, China in 1614. Wickham died at Bantam in 1617, and Nelson was carried off by consumption at Hirado in March 1629. That must be 1619. A most severe loss was Adam's death, May the 16th, 1620. He died near the English factory, and it was probably only his ashes that were transported to Hemimura, where his grave is now situated. In fact, his grave is now established as being at Hemi. Sorry, not at Hemi, at Hirado. Sayers had been banished from Hirado by order of the daimyo after a Japanese nobleman had been punished for assaulting him. Thus there remained on the little island only Cox, Eaton, and a junior clerk, Osterwick, who had been sent out in 1615. Eaton wrote in a letter to the company that the treaty defence was welcome news unto us that live here. The Treaty of Defence, I think that is. Yeah. Cox was more emphatic. God be praised for it, he wrote, and God grant the Dutch may as firmly follow the orders prescribed as I make no doubt the English will do. The English factory became simply an agency of the fleet of defence, and was kept very busy purveying everything required for the English ships, storing away the spoils that fell to the English share, and disposing of them at reasonable rates. The first expedition of the fleet of defence was not very successful. Only one ship was brought as a prize to Hirado. It was a Portuguese frigate, sailing from Manila via Macau to Japan, with a Japanese Christian, Joachim Diaz Hirayama, as captain, and 4 Spaniards, some Portuguese, and many Japanese merchants or passengers. The English ship Elizabeth of 800 tons had seized it in the Straits of Formosa, Taiwan. Whether this piratical act would be punished by the Japanese authorities became the question of a long lawsuit in which the Dutch and English were victorious only because the captain and crew had committed the deadly crime of bringing 2 disguised missionary priests, a Spaniard and a Fleming, to Japan. After both would-be merchants had confessed their identity, the ship and some gold and silver on board became, after 2 years' litigation, the property of both companies. The unfortunate friars and the captain who had brought them to Japan were roasted to death, August 22nd, 1622. Oh dear. In the meantime, 2 other piratical expeditions had been undertaken by the combined fleet assembled at Hirado. They proved more profitable and brought about £5,000 into the coffers of the English factory, 2 frigate and 7 junks having been captured. But the alliance of the 2 companies was again dissolved in 1622 because the English only sent their half of the stipulated number of ships and refused to contribute for the building of Batavia hostilities of the building of Batavia. Period, I think that is. Hostilities recommenced between the Dutch and the English in the May archipelago, culminating eventually in the notorious Amboyana massacre of February 1623, for which 2 English kings and the Commonwealth in vain demanded justice. In the whole Far East, i.e. all countries east of the Straits, the English East India Company withdrew in the 17th century before the more energetic Dutch Verenigde Ostindische Compagnie, the VOC. In these difficult circumstances, the far outlying and isolated factory at Hirado was quite useless and even a source of weakness. Until the trouble with the Dutch was settled, it was therefore necessary to withdraw from Japan as well. Already in 1622, orders had been sent to the presidency at Javatra to see this effected. Cox was ordered by the president and council at that place to return with all the movables of the factory and keep only the buildings for a happier future, leaving, if need be, young Osterwick as representative behind. Poor young chap. Unfortunately, the English merchants at Hirado did not see things in the same gloomy light, as they had lately sent home valuable cargoes, chiefly of silver. Nor were they in the habit of receiving orders from anybody but the Court of Directors in London. They did not obey at once, and some special officer had to be sent to see the dissolution of the Hirado factory carried out. Sorely was Cox to suffer at Batavia for the disobedience, and for some shortcomings of his in the management of affairs during the latter half of his career in Japan. The outstanding debts in Japan amounted to £3,200. More than half of this sum was due from the captain of the Chinaman at Hirado, who had been allowed such a large credit in consideration of his alleged influence at the court of Peking and his promise to secure privileges of trade for the English directly from the Chinese emperor. There can be no doubt that Cox had been greatly humbugged by this man. The sentence against Cox by the court at Batavia in February 1624 was that his property was to be seized and he was sent home to be dealt with as the court of directors might think fit. But Cox was not spared to see his native country again and receive final judgment there. He died on board ship on the 27th of March 1624. R.I.P. The English factory at Hirado was certainly no success, as it was dissolved only 10 years after its foundation. But whether it was so decided a failure as it is generally pronounced to have been, may perhaps be justly doubted. That it caused a loss of £40,000 to the East India Company is certainly a great exaggeration. Everything sent to Japan in the whole time of its existence did not amount to so much, and there were, as we have seen, considerable returns. I think the origin of that statement goes back to the calculation of a clerk in the office of the East India Company in London, who knew that £4,000 in ready money had been sent to Japan in the beginning, and that almost nothing had reached London from Japan. He probably multiplied this loss of the first year by the number of years the Hirado factory had existed, when Cox's brother came to claim the confiscated property of the former Cape merchant. The real property of the English East India Company at Hirado was left in trust with the daimyo of Hirado, but never reclaimed. We cannot even say where it was situated. The topographical appellation of the English embankment is still found in an old book on Hirado, but nobody can identify its position. The only trace left on the spot of the former English factory is a piece of masonry on a hill outside the town. It is part of the wall of the burying places of the English factory and was built in 1621. Discussion. All right, so this is Q&A, question and answer after the talk. The chairman, that's Sir Ernest Satow, observed, in regard to the statement of the lecturer that the document given by Purchas was not the first Japanese text printed in Europe, that it had been preceded by the title deed of a Buddhist temple granted to the Roman Catholic missionaries at Yamaguchi, of which a facsimile is given in the volume of letters printed at Naples in 1573, and again in the Cologne reprint of 1574, half a century before Purchas. He remarked that the lecturer had given a demonstration of the position of Adams, which entirely refuted the ordinary belief that he was a mere common seaman. In fact, he had owed his favour with Ieyasu to his knowledge of shipbuilding, a fact that showed he was much more than a common seaman. Right, so he wasn't trained as a shipwright, but he had knowledge of shipbuilding. Must have done to build 2 ships. The title pilot also implied a high position on board a ship, corresponding more nearly to that of sailing master in a man of war. The lecturer had also pointed out 2 other facts, namely the jurisdiction given to the English factor over his own countrymen, so that he combined with his duties as Cape merchant something of the consular office. A good deal had been said as to extraterritorial jurisdiction that was not quite justified. The grant of it was regarded at many periods of history as a matter of course. It appeared quite natural that individuals should be judged by their own law. The practice prevailed in the Middle Ages and was adopted by Turkey. In Japan, where every baron had jurisdiction over his own people, it was a recognized institution, and its embodiment in the modern treaties, the first of which was negotiated by Mr. Harris, the United States representative of the day, was perfectly in accord with Japanese ideas. Interesting. The other fact was the power of negotiating with foreign countries which the shogun had possessed in the 17th century. The chairman believed, however, that sometime in the 19th century it became a practice to communicate information on foreign affairs to the imperial court, and that he had been told that the first instance was the occasion of the Russian visit to the northern islands of the Japanese Empire. With regard to the sales of English goods, which the lecturer had stated were sometimes at the rate of double the cost price, that might not appear so very profitable when all the charges were added, if it were remembered that a voyage took a long time in those days, and that ships came up the China Sea with the southwest monsoon and returned with the northeastern, so that the round voyage from Malacca and Bantam would take about 12 months. That would account for the sales even at such apparently high prices, not leaving much margin of profit. It was interesting to learn that the Clove on her return voyage to England carried some Japanese sailors among her crew, and that they afterwards returned to this country. The mission sent to the Pope in 1582 by some of the Kyushu daimyos was of course well known, but Japanese had been in Europe even earlier. In one of Loyola's letters, 26th of July 1554, there was mention of a Japanese Christian visiting Rome, and his arrival is spoken of in a letter of 21st March 1555. Who this Japanese was, the speaker had not been able to ascertain. The Japanese at that time went abroad a good deal, to say nothing of the presence of some Japanese at Amboina in 1622 on the occasion of the famous massacre of the English, along with whom they were subjected to indescribable tortures. There was the first Japanese convert of St. Francis Xavier, who met him in Malacca about 1540. But even before that, it might be held that Japanese frequented that part of the world. In the account of the capture of Malacca by Albuquerque in 1511, mention is made of junks from Ryukyu, the Okinawan chain. But if the inhabitants of those islands were not more enterprising in those days than now, it may be assumed that these so-called Ryukyu junks really came from Japan. The chairman concluded his remarks by thanking Dr. Riess in the name of the society for his valuable lecture. The meeting then adjourned. Stop the share. Okay. Well, there we are. So that's a summary of the longer paper, which I have printed out from the transactions of the Asiatic Society of Japan. It's over 100 pages. And so it's good to be able to read a summary. There's quite a lot of interest, I think, here about the factory. And the English is very accessible, I find. So really, I'm glad that I took Sir Ernest's suggestion to have a look at this work by Ludwig Riess, Professor Ludwig Riess of Tokyo University. So thank you very much for persevering up to this point, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye for now.